The lawyer's voice cracked through the speakerphone like ice splitting. Your grandmother left everything to your brother Kyle, and I stood frozen in my Seattle apartment, phone trembling against my ear, unable to process what I just heard. I'm Emma Carter, 28 years old, and for the past 6 years, I'd been my grandmother Marion's primary caregiver, driving 3 hours every weekend from Seattle to Bellingham to help with groceries, medications, doctor appointments, and those quiet Sunday dinners she loved. My brother Kyle, meanwhile, hadn't visited her once in 4 years, too busy building his real estate empire in California to bother with family. Yet somehow he'd convinced her to sign a new will 3 months before her death, cutting me out completely and leaving him her $890,000 estate, the waterfront cottage, and all her belongings. The attorney, a man named Bernard Hughes, explained that Marion had been very clear about her wishes and suggested I accept this outcome gracefully. But something felt wrong. My grandmother had promised me that cottage 1,000 times, told me I'd earned it through love and sacrifice, and now Bernard was telling me to walk away from 6 years of caregiving with nothing but memories. I hung up and immediately called Kyle, my hands shaking with rage and confusion, and when he answered, his voice carried that smug tone I'd grown to hate over the years. "Look, Emma, Grandma made her choice," he said, ice clinking in what I assumed was his afternoon whiskey. "Maybe if you'd built something with your life instead of playing nurse, she would have respected you more." The words hit like a slap, but I kept my voice steady and asked him directly if he'd manipulated her, if he'd visited her behind my back, if he'd lied to get her to change the will. He laughed, actually laughed, and told me I was being paranoid, that Marion had simply recognized his business acumen and wanted her assets managed properly, not wasted on someone who works retail at 28. I worked as a museum curator, not that it mattered to Kyle, who measured worth only in dollar signs and property portfolios. Before I could respond, he added that the cottage would be sold within the month to fund a new investment property. And if I wanted any of Marion's personal items, I should come get them before the estate sale. Then he hung up. I sat in the dark for an hour, crying and replaying every Sunday dinner, every medication schedule I'd managed, every time I'd held Marion's Hamotan through chemo treatments while Kyle sent impersonal text messages from business conferences. I caught my reflection in the window, pale skin, blotchy from crying, my auburn hair pulled back in a messy ponytail, and felt the weight of complete exhaustion. Something wasn't right about this situation, and my gut screamed that Kyle had done something unethical, possibly illegal, to steal what should have been mine. I'd never cared about the money. The estate could have gone to charity for all I cared. But that cottage represented Marion's love, her acknowledgement of my sacrifice, and the place where I'd spent my childhood summers, learning to paint watercolors on the deck while she told stories about her own grandmother. Kyle was going to bulldoze those memories for profit, and I couldn't let that happen without a fight. I opened my laptop and started researching Washington state inheritance law, reading about undue influence, testamentary capacity, and the legal requirements for valid wills. By 2 a.m., I'd filled a notebook with information about challenging estates and had scheduled a consultation with an attorney named Patricia Wong, who specialized in probate disputes. 3 days later, I sat in Patricia's downtown Seattle office, a space filled with law books and framed degrees, laying out my entire history with Marion, while Patricia took notes on a yellow legal pad. I explained the caregiving timeline, showed her photos of us together at medical appointments, presented the text messages Marion had sent me, saying, "The cottage will be yours someday, sweetheart," and described Kyle's 4-year absence from her life. Patricia listened carefully, her expression neutral, and when I finished, she leaned back and asked the critical question, did I have any evidence that Marion's mental capacity had declined before signing the new will? I admitted I didn't have medical records proving dementia or cognitive impairment, but I explained that Marion had been on heavy pain medications for cancer and had moments of confusion during her final months. Patricia explained that challenging the will would require proving either that Marion lacked testamentary capacity when signing, or that Kyle had exercised undue influence, essentially manipulating or coercing her into changing her estate plan. Both were difficult to prove without concrete evidence. I left Patricia's office feeling defeated, the $350 consultation fee barely worth the discouraging news, but she'd given me one useful piece of advice. Start documenting everything, gather any evidence of Marion's mental state, and try to obtain copies of the new will and any communications between Kyle and Marion. That evening, I drove to Bellingham, using the key I still had to Marion's cottage, and let myself into the quiet space that smelled like lavender and old books. Everything looked the same. Her reading chair by the window, the china cabinet full of family heirlooms, the walls covered with my watercolor paintings she'd framed and hung with pride. But the air felt different, emptier, like the house knew she was gone. I started searching carefully through her desk, looking for anything that might help my case, and found her daily planner where she'd meticulously recorded appointments and notes. Flipping through the final months, I noticed something strange. On May 15th, she'd written Kyle visiting, discuss estate, and then 3 more entries over the next month showing Kyle's visits, something he'd sworn hadn't happened. My heart raced as I photographed every page of the planner with my phone, creating a timeline of Kyle's sudden reappearance in Marion's life, right before the will changed. I continued searching and found a folder labeled Legal Documents, containing a copy of Marion's original will from 2019, the one that left the cottage to me and split the remaining assets equally between Kyle and me. Comparing it to the new will Bernard had mentioned, I could see dramatic differences. The new version was dated June 18th, just 6 weeks before Marion's death, and every mention of my name had been removed. I photographed everything, my hands trembling with a mixture of anger and vindication. In the back of Marion's desk drawer, I found something even more interesting. A stack of greeting cards from Kyle, all dated within those final 3 months, each one filled with excessive praise about what a brilliant woman she was and how he wanted to make her proud by handling her legacy properly. The cards felt manipulative, performative, like Kyle was building a paper trail of fake affection. I kept searching and discovered Marion's checkbook, which showed several unusual withdrawals in the months before her death. $5,000 on May 20th, $8,000 on June 3rd, and $12,000 on June 10th, all marked as cash with no explanation. Marion had always been meticulous about money, noting every expense, but these large withdrawals had no corresponding notes. I photographed the check register and continued through her papers, finding receipts, medical bills, and finally, wedged between 2 books on her shelf, a handwritten note on Marion's personal stationery dated June 15th, 3 days before the new will was signed. The note read, "Emma, if you're reading this, something has gone wrong. Kyle has been pressuring me about the estate, saying you don't need the cottage because you're young and have your whole life ahead. He says he'll manage everything properly and make sure the family legacy continues. I don't know what to do. He's so insistent and I'm so tired. I love you both, but I'm confused." The note wasn't signed, as if Marion had been interrupted while writing it, but the handwriting was definitely hers, shaky and uncertain. I sat on Marion's floor, holding that note and crying because it was proof, actual proof, that Kyle had manipulated her when she was vulnerable, sick, and exhausted from cancer treatments. This wasn't a grandmother making a clear-headed decision about her estate. This was a dying woman being pressured by a greedy son who'd ignored her for years, until money became involved. I carefully photographed the note, added it to my growing collection of evidence, and continued searching the cottage. In Marion's bedroom closet, I found a locked metal box I'd never noticed before, small and gray with a combination lock. I tried Marion's birthday, her anniversary, my birthday. Nothing worked. Then I remembered her favorite number, the address of her childhood home, 1847. The box clicked open. Inside were more documents, medical records showing her cancer diagnosis and treatment timeline, a letter from her doctor noting increased confusion and memory issues related to pain medication, and a business card from a notary public named Tom Bradford with a handwritten note on the back, called by Kyle Carter to witness will signing. Patient seemed uncertain, but confirmed verbally. The notary's note was exactly what I needed, evidence that even the person witnessing the will signing had noticed Marion's uncertainty. I photographed everything in the box, then carefully relocked it and returned it to its hiding place, making sure to leave the cottage exactly as I'd found it. As I drove back to Seattle that night, my phone buzzed with a text from Kyle. "Bernard says you've been asking questions about the estate. Don't embarrass yourself by fighting this. Grandma made her choice. Move on." I didn't respond, but I forwarded the texts to Patricia along with all the photos I'd taken, explaining what I'd discovered. Within an hour, Patricia called me back, her voice energized in a way it hadn't been during our consultation. She said the planner entries, the handwritten note, and especially the notary's observation about Marion's uncertainty could form the basis of a strong undue influence claim, and the medical records showing cognitive issues might support a lack of capacity argument. She offered to take my case on contingency, meaning she'd only get paid if we won, because she believed we had a real shot. Over the next 2 weeks, Patricia filed a formal challenge to Marion's will with the probate court, arguing both undue influence and lack of testamentary capacity, and requesting a full investigation into the circumstances surrounding the will's creation. Kyle's response was immediate and furious. He called me screaming about how I was tarnishing Marion's memory, dragging the family through unnecessary legal battles, and wasting everyone's time and money. He threatened to countersue for legal fees, to expose my money-grabbing behavior to extended family, and to make sure I never got a single item from Marion's estate, not even a photograph. I recorded the call as Patricia had instructed me to do with all communications and forwarded it to her. She added it to our evidence file, noting that Kyle's aggressive reaction suggested he knew his position was weak. The court scheduled a hearing for August 12th, which gave us 6 weeks to build our case, interview witnesses, and potentially depose Kyle and the attorney who'd prepared the new will. Patricia warned me that probate litigation could get ugly, expensive, and emotionally draining, but I told her I didn't care. This wasn't about money, it was about justice. Patricia subpoenaed Marion's medical records, her banking statements, and communications between Kyle and Bernard Hughes, the attorney who'd prepared the will. We also scheduled a deposition with Tom Bradford, the notary who'd witnessed the signing, hoping to get him on record about Marion's state of mind. I spent those weeks gathering character witnesses, Marion's neighbors, her friends from church, her oncologist, anyone who could testify about her cognitive decline and Kyle's absence from her life. My friend Vanessa, who'd often joined me on visits to Marion, agreed to testify about the loving relationship Marion and I had shared, and how Marion had repeatedly expressed her wish for me to inherit the cottage. Meanwhile, Kyle hired an expensive probate attorney named Stuart Phillips, who immediately filed motions to dismiss our challenge, arguing that we lacked standing and that Marion's will was legally valid. The legal bills started piling up, even with Patricia's contingency arrangement, and I spent my savings on filing fees, expert witness costs, and court-related expenses. I survived on ramen and gave up my apartment to move into Vanessa's spare room, pouring every resource into this fight. The deposition with Tom Bradford happened on July 20th in a conference room downtown, with Tom, his attorney, Patricia, Stuart Phillips, and a court reporter all present. Under oath, Tom confirmed that Kyle had contacted him to witness the will signing at Marion's cottage on June 18th, that Marion had seemed frail and somewhat confused, and that he'd asked her multiple times if she understood what she was signing. Tom testified that Marion had said yes each time, but had looked at Kyle frequently, as if seeking approval or confirmation. When Patricia asked if Marion seemed to be acting independently, Tom hesitated and then admitted it seemed like her son was very involved in explaining the documents to her, more than I'd usually see in a will signing. Stuart objected repeatedly, trying to characterize Tom's observations as speculation, but the damage was done. We had a witness confirming that Marion had seemed uncertain and heavily influenced by Kyle's presence. After the deposition, Patricia told me this was strong evidence, but we needed more to definitively prove undue influence. We needed someone who'd witnessed Kyle's manipulation directly. I remembered that Marion had a home health aide named Gloria Santos who'd helped with her care during the final months, someone I'd met several times but hadn't thought to contact earlier. I tracked down Gloria through the home health agency and called her, explaining the situation and asking if she'd be willing to talk about Marion's final months. Gloria was hesitant at first, worried about confidentiality and getting involved in family disputes, but when I mentioned Kyle's name, her tone changed. "That man," she said quietly, "he would show up and talk to your grandmother about money for hours. She would be exhausted after his visits, crying sometimes, saying she didn't know what to do." Gloria agreed to meet me at a coffee shop, and when we sat down, she told me everything. She described how Kyle had started visiting in May, always when I wasn't there, and would spend hours talking to Marion about protecting the family legacy and how I was too young and irresponsible to handle the cottage. Gloria said Marion would defend me, but Kyle was relentless, visiting multiple times a week and wearing her down. Gloria's most damning testimony was about the week the will was signed. She said Kyle had visited Marion every single day that week, bringing flowers and expensive gifts, and had even offered to pay Gloria extra to give them private time to discuss family matters. Gloria had refused, staying in the house as Marion's advocate, but she'd overheard Kyle telling Marion that I'd told him I didn't want the cottage, that I'd rather he handle everything because I was focused on my career in Seattle. This was a complete lie. I'd never said anything of the sort, but Marion had believed it, crying and saying she didn't want to burden me. Gloria testified that on the day the will was signed, Marion had asked her, "Am I doing the right thing?" And Gloria had encouraged her to wait, to talk to me first. But Kyle had rushed the process, saying the attorney and notary were already on their way. I recorded Gloria's statement, had her sign an affidavit, and Patricia immediately added her to our witness list. This was the breakthrough we needed. Direct testimony of Kyle's manipulation. The hearing date arrived, and I walked into the courthouse wearing the only professional outfit I owned, my stomach churning with anxiety and anticipation. The courtroom was smaller than I'd expected, wood-paneled and formal, with Judge Helen Ortiz presiding. Kyle sat with Stuart Phillips at one table, looking confident in an expensive suit, while Patricia and I sat at the other. The judge reviewed the case file and asked Patricia to present our argument first. Patricia methodically laid out the timeline: Kyle's 4-year absence from Marion's life, his sudden reappearance 3 months before her death, the pattern of visits designed to isolate Marion from me, the medical evidence of cognitive decline, Tom Bradford's testimony about Marion's uncertainty, and Gloria Santos's first-hand account of manipulation. She presented the handwritten note Marion had left, the checkbook showing unusual cash withdrawals that coincided with Kyle's visits, and character testimony from Marion's friends confirming that she'd always intended to leave me the cottage. The evidence was overwhelming, each piece building on the last, creating an undeniable picture of undue influence. Stuart Phillips stood to present Kyle's defense, arguing that Marion had been mentally competent when signing the will, that she'd made a rational decision to leave her estate to her son rather than her granddaughter, and that our evidence of undue influence was circumstantial at best. He characterized Kyle's visits as appropriate family care during Marion's final months, and suggested that I was simply a bitter heir who couldn't accept being cut out. Kyle took the stand and testified that he'd reconnected with Marion because he'd matured and wanted to repair their relationship, that she'd been sharp and clear-headed when discussing her estate, and that she'd made the decision independently. Under cross-examination, however, Patricia destroyed his credibility. She confronted him with the planner entries, proving he'd lied about the frequency and timing of his visits, with Gloria's testimony contradicting his claims about Marion's mental state, and with phone records showing he'd called Bernard Hughes multiple times before ever visiting Marion. Patricia asked him directly about the cash withdrawals, and Kyle stumbled, claiming he knew nothing about them, which seemed impossible given his sudden involvement in Marion's finances. The most devastating moment came when Patricia asked Kyle about the lie he'd told Marion, that I'd said I didn't want the cottage. Kyle denied saying it, But when Patricia presented Gloria's sworn affidavit detailing the exact conversation, Kyle's face went pale. He tried to explain it away, saying he must have misunderstood something I'd said, but he couldn't provide any evidence of such a conversation because it had never happened. Judge Ortiz asked Kyle directly if he'd visited Marion with the intention of changing her will, and Kyle hesitated just long enough for the answer to be obvious. "I wanted what was best for the family estate," he finally said, which wasn't an answer at all. Patricia rested our case, and after a brief recess, Judge Ortiz returned with her preliminary ruling. She said she'd found credible evidence of undue influence, particularly Gloria Santos' testimony and Tom Bradford's observations about Marion's uncertainty. She noted that the timing and pattern of Kyle's visits, combined with Marion's medical records showing cognitive issues related to pain medication, raised serious questions about testamentary capacity. Judge Ortiz didn't issue a final ruling that day, but instead ordered mediation, suggesting strongly that Kyle should consider settling this matter rather than proceeding to a full trial where he risked losing everything plus paying both sides legal fees. She scheduled a mediation session for 2 weeks later and warned both parties that if we couldn't reach an agreement, she would rule from the bench based on the evidence presented. Walking out of the courthouse, I felt cautiously optimistic for the first time in months. Patricia squeezed my shoulder and said, "That went better than I expected. The judge clearly sees through Kyle's story." Kyle and Stuart rushed past us without making eye contact, and I heard Stuart urgently telling Kyle they needed to discuss settlement options. That night, Patricia called to say Stuart had already reached out about potential settlement terms, which meant Kyle knew he was in trouble. The mediation session was scheduled for August 26th, and Patricia warned me to prepare for difficult negotiations. Kyle would likely offer partial concessions to avoid a total loss, and I'd need to decide what outcome I could accept. The mediation took place in a neutral conference room with a professional mediator named Harold Winston facilitating the discussion. We sat on opposite sides of a long table, Kyle and Stuart on one side, Patricia and me on the other, while Harold explained the process and ground rules. Stuart opened by offering me $100,000 from the estate and 3 specific items of Marion's I could choose, in exchange for accepting the will as valid. I almost laughed at the insult. $100,000 out of an $890,000 estate after 6 years of caregiving, and Patricia immediately rejected the offer, countering that we wanted the original 2019 will reinstated, which meant I'd receive the cottage and half of the remaining assets. Stuart called this unreasonable, arguing that even if some undue influence occurred, Marion had still signed the will of her own free choice. The mediation went back and forth for 3 hours, with Harold shuttling between rooms as we retreated to separate spaces. During one break, Patricia told me she thought Kyle would eventually agree to a 60-40 split favoring me, plus the cottage, because his alternative was a full trial he'd likely lose. I told her I wanted justice, not just money. By late afternoon, Kyle's position had shifted significantly. Through Harold, Stuart proposed that I receive the cottage valued at approximately $320,000, plus $350,000 in cash from the Cap estate, with Kyle keeping the remaining $220,000 and all investment accounts. This would give me roughly 75% of the estate's value, acknowledging my role as primary caregiver and the questionable circumstances of the will change. Patricia advised me this was a strong offer, better than we might achieve at trial despite our good evidence, and it would let me keep the cottage that mattered most. But I hesitated because accepting this settlement would mean Kyle faced no real consequences for manipulating Marion, and the new will would technically remain valid even if practically overridden by our agreement. I asked Patricia if there was any way to get Kyle to admit wrongdoing or face accountability beyond just financial redistribution. She said that was unlikely in a civil mediation, but she'd try. During the next round of negotiations, Patricia demanded that as part of any settlement, Kyle write a letter acknowledging that Marion had been vulnerable when he'd influenced her estate planning decisions. Stuart initially refused, saying Kyle would never sign such an admission because it could expose him to legal liability or damage his reputation. But Patricia held firm, explaining to Harold that justice for Marion required more than just money changing hands. It required acknowledging the truth about what had happened. Harold spent an hour alone with Kyle and Stuart, and when they emerged, Stuart had drafted a carefully worded statement Kyle would sign as part of the settlement. It read, "I acknowledge that during Marion Carter's final months, I may have exercised influence over her estate planning decisions at a time when she was physically and emotionally vulnerable. While I believed I was acting in the family's best interests, I recognize that my actions may have pressured her in ways that were not appropriate. I regret any pain this situation has caused my niece Emma, and I acknowledge Marion's deep love for her and her original intentions regarding the cottage." It wasn't a full confession, but it was something, an admission that Kyle had influenced Marion improperly. I agreed to accept the settlement, the cottage, $350,000, and Kyle's signed statement, in exchange for dropping the will challenge. The settlement was finalized on September 3rd, with both parties signing the agreement in front of Harold and our attorneys. Judge Ortiz approved the settlement, and within 2 weeks, the funds were transferred to my account, $350,000, that represented not just financial security, but validation of everything I'd done for Marion. The cottage was deeded to me, and I spent my first night there as the legal owner sitting on the deck where Marion and I had painted watercolors together, watching the sunset over the water and feeling her presence in every corner of the space. Kyle and I never spoke again after the settlement. I heard through family members that he'd sold most of his real estate portfolio to cover the settlement and his legal fees, and that his wife had left him, tired of his obsession with money and status. I felt no satisfaction in his downfall, just a quiet sense of justice. The cottage became my refuge, a place where I could process Marion's loss and begin rebuilding my life. I quit my museum job and started teaching art classes to seniors, work that felt meaningful and connected to Marion's memory. Over the next year, I renovated the cottage carefully, preserving everything Marion had loved while making it fully mine. I converted her reading room into an art studio, hung my paintings throughout the house, and started a small business selling watercolors of the Bellingham waterfront to tourists. The $350,000 settlement gave me financial stability I'd never had before, and I invested most of it conservatively, using only what I needed to cover renovation costs and living expenses. I thought often about the fight, the months of stress, the legal bills, the emotional toll of battling my own brother, and wondered if it had been worth it. But every time I sat on Marion's deck or taught a painting class to elderly students who reminded me of her, I knew the answer. It had been worth every moment because I'd honored Marion's true wishes and protected her legacy from someone who'd tried to exploit her vulnerability. The cottage represented more than property or money. It represented love, sacrifice, and the bond between a grandmother and granddaughter that had transcended death and legal manipulation. I also learned lessons about family, greed, and justice that I'd carry forever. I learned that blood doesn't guarantee loyalty, that people will surprise you with their capacity for selfishness when money is involved, and that standing up for what's right often requires fighting battles that seem unwinnable. I learned that documentation matters. Every photo I'd taken of Marion's planner, every affidavit I'd collected, every piece of evidence Patricia and I had assembled had made the difference between justice and defeat. I learned that the legal system, despite its flaws and expenses, could still work for ordinary people if they were willing to persist. And I learned that kindness and caregiving, though often dismissed as worthless by people like Kyle who measure value only in dollars, are actually the most valuable things we can offer each other. Marion had taught me that through her example and fighting for her estate had reinforced that lesson. The victory wasn't about the money or the property. It was about proving that love and integrity matter more than greed and manipulation. Now, sitting on my deck 2 years after Marion's death, I understand that this story isn't really about a will or an inheritance. It's about the choice between being a person who cares for others and being a person who exploits them. Kyle chose exploitation and paid for it with his marriage, his reputation, and most of his wealth. I chose caregiving and was rewarded not just with financial security, but with peace of mind, meaningful work, and the knowledge that I'd honored someone I loved. Marion's cottage has become a gathering place for friends and family, a space where I teach art and host dinners and keep alive the values Marion embodied. Every Sunday, I sit in her reading chair and think about our conversations, our laughter, the quiet moments of connection that money can never buy. Kyle took 4 years away from knowing Marion because he was too focused on building wealth, and when he finally returned, it was only to take more. I gave 6 years to loving her, and what I received in return, memories, lessons, and yes, this cottage, are worth more than any estate. That's the truth Kyle never understood, and it's the truth that ultimately defeated him. Justice isn't always served, but sometimes, if you fight hard enough and document everything, it is.